Before we get into more serious learning, there's one more thing I want to bring up that hits a lot of beginners. Who am I kidding? It hits everyone. That thing is how to understand error messages. The more code you write, the more errors you're going to encounter. It's just another part of programming. We'll just use the Python shell to generate a couple of errors and dissect them. We'll start with a couple of the most common ones, name error and type error. So the first thing we need to do is get into our shell again. So we're going to go ahead and type Python to bring up the Python shell. And the first error I want to look at is a name error. A name error happens whenever you try to use something that doesn't exist as far as Python's concerned. Like right now, we haven't created any variables or functions or anything like that. So we can't use any functions or variables unless Python automatically has provided them to us. For instance, let's pretend we're back in Algebra 1, and I want to try and add 5 to a variable named x. So we'll say 5 plus x. And I get a name error. And the name error that I get is that the name x, so this variable here that I tried to use, is not defined. That's just Python's way of saying, hey, you told me there was a name that's named x, and when I went looking for x, I couldn't find it. So we haven't said what x is. Sadly, programming in standard Python isn't like algebra class, and we can't just make up placeholder names. We'd get the same error if we tried to use a function that doesn't exist. Like maybe we want to run a function to call our best friend. So call best friend, and exact same error, still a name error, but now it says that the name call best friend is not defined. And it's right, call best friend is not defined. We'll talk about how to make your own functions later on. Right now, I just want you to understand what this error means in case you run into it at some point. Because chances are you will, because I do, because everyone else does. Errors happen all the time to everyone, and they're fine. The other really common error is type error. Now, usually you get this for 2 reasons. Either you gave the wrong type of argument to a function, like a function expected a number, and you gave it a string, or because you tried to do something that particular type doesn't support. So you can't add a number and a string together. It doesn't make any sense. There's no way to add those 2 things together. And so that gives us a type error. And it tells us that we have an unsupported operand type, and the operand is this thing. Operand is a fancier, jargony way of saying, you told me to do an operation, like plus, minus, times, divided, whatever. I don't know how to do that thing, right? So it doesn't know how to add an int, so a number, and stir, which is a string. So it doesn't know how to do that. Now, we can, of course, add 2 numbers together. I mean, 5 plus 5 is going to give us 10. And we can add 2 strings together. Tree plus house is going to give us tree house. So the real problem isn't that neither type understands the plus sign. It's not that neither type understands the operand. It's that strings can only be added to strings, and ints, or numbers of any kind, can only be added to other numbers. And that makes sense. I mean, how would you add the letter A to the number 5 anyway? The last common error that we should talk about is the syntax error. Now, this one will probably bite you more than the other 2, and it's also probably the most cryptic. Anytime that you see syntax error, it just means that you wrote some code incorrectly so that Python just can't understand it. Now, we've already printed some information to the screen in the past using the print function. Print normally prints strings, so let's try that. So we'll say print hello, and it prints out hello. But what if I'm busy, I'm just coding along, and I forget my quote mark, and I press return? I got a syntax error. Oh no, syntax error. Now, looking at the output though, it's pointing with this little arrow right here to the end of my word. Now, did I do something wrong there? Yeah, I did. I forgot the quote mark. I haven't used the correct syntax or way of writing the code, and so Python gave me an error. In fact, in this case, the error even says, very cryptically, that I left off the end of the string. EOL stands for end of line. And this tells me that Python ran out of string unexpectedly. It thought the string was still going, and it never found the end of the string. It kept looking for that closing quote mark and never found it. So it ran out of string and got to the end of the line, and it didn't expect one. Finally, though, this gives us a problem that knitters and programmers can come together on, right? Running out of string. Sorry for that one, too. We can fix this, of course, by putting the closing quote mark into our code, and we'd run it again just like we did the first time. So awesome, all better. 3 errors that you can now understand and survive. Knowing what these errors mean and how to fix them is a big part of debugging your Python code. Don't let errors like this discourage you or knock you off of your game. Every programmer ever has had to deal with errors like this, and worse. Welcome to a long line of coders shaking their fists at their screens. Okay, so you've been introduced to variables and functions. You've seen how to write code in the Python shell or in a script, and you can decode a couple of error messages. You're in great shape to actually start learning the ins and outs of Python programming.